This is the BBC Live programme. Here is the news.
Here is the first part of a two-part, 2-minute history of Brookfield, with a diversion into the history of the Barrow estate. Our story starts in the early 1950s when Brookfield was a 100-acre farm that formed part of the estate owned by the local squire, Clive Lawson Hope. At the heart of Brookfield was the farmhouse, occupied by its tenant, Dan Archer, and his wife Doris, who in her youth had been lady's maid to the squire's wife, Letty Lawson Hope. The squire had no children and was getting on in years. His favourite nephew, also called Clive, arrived in 1952 to run the estate, rescuing it from financial decline. In early 1954, the younger Clive inherited a farm in Kenya from another uncle, Percy, and went off to Africa to make his fortune. That left the squire with little alternative but to sell the estate. The main purchasers were the Bellamy family and George Fairbrother, but Dan took the opportunity to buy Brookfield. Fairbrother sold his land, around 3,500 acres, to Charles Grenville a few years later. In 1965, after Grenville's death, the land was sold to Ralph Bellamy in partnership with Jack Woolley. Bellamy broke up the estate in the early 1970s, with 1,500 acres becoming Home Farm, bought by Brian Aldridge. A further 1,000 acres was sold to a Mr. Barnett, while Bellamy kept the remaining 1,000, subsequently known as the Barrow estate. When he died, Lillian inherited it, and in 1990 she sold it to Cameron Fraser, who went bankrupt. Small farms were finding it increasingly challenging to be viable. Dan's neighbour, Fred Barrett, who was also the chair of the local NFU, suggested to Dan that they amalgamate their respective dairy operations together with that of a third neighbour, Jess Allard. The three farmers established Ambridge Dairy Farmers Limited in 1961. By the following year, Jess had died, and Dan acquired Allard's farm and installed his son as manager, renaming it Hollow Tree Farm. Then in 1965, Fred Barrett sold up Barrett's farm, formerly Sixpenny Farm, also to Dan Archer, except for a couple of acres and the farmhouse, which Fred sold to Aunt Laura Archer, who sold it a few years later to Lillian, whom she had helped set up a riding school on the land. Lillian renamed Barrett's farmhouse as The Stables. As a result of the acquisition of Hollow Tree and Barrett's farm, by the end of the 1960s, Brookfield had grown from 100 to 435 acres.